This video is going to cover the differences between necrosis and apoptosis and why cells die in these two different ways. So first of all, what is necrosis? This is a form of accidental or unregulated cell death, and is typically a result of some kind of stress that a cell can't adapt to that creates an irreversible injury. And as the cell death is unregulated, as it dies, it also causes inflammation in the surrounding tissue. Now, because the cell wasn't intended to die and it's hurting the surrounding cells, this is referred to as a pathologic type of cell death. Now, why this occurs, / how cells die via necrosis. It starts off with the swelling that occurs in these cells, and this is because of a reduction in ATP levels. Now, ATP is primarily produced by oxidative phosphorylation, and this is done by the mitochondria with the help of oxygen. Now, this is probably over 90% of the energy requirements for the cell, and if you reduce oxygen or nutrients, or even if you damage the mitochondria or introduce certain toxins, you're going to prevent the majority of this ATP production. One of the things that ATP powers in the cell is actually pumps that will remove sodium from the cytosol and let a little bit of potassium in. And within a healthy cell, there is a net balance of a little bit more of these ions or solutes kept outside of the cell. Now, with a 5 to 10% reduction in ATP levels from the damage to the mitochondria, this is enough to affect that plasma membrane pump. And once the pump fails, there's going to be an accumulation of sodium within the cell itself. Now, water tends to follow sodium or follow solutes, so once these start to accumulate within the cell, water is going to follow those in, and that is going to cause the cell to swell. The other thing we primarily see within necrosis is this severe damage to membranes, and this is largely due to calcium levels building up within the cell. Now, calcium is typically kept pretty low within the cytosol, but when there is pump failure, for example, because there is no energy from the mitochondria, or if there is ischemia or even some toxins are introduced, it can start to accumulate within the cytoplasm of the cell. And increased cytosolic calcium can lead to a couple things, such as enzyme activation, and these enzymes are things like phospholipases and proteases. Your cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, so this is going to start to break down membranes. Proteases are going to start breaking down proteins, and remember that your membrane itself has a bunch of protein pumps and protein channels within it, so this is going to cause additional membrane damage. It's going to start breaking down ATP, so that's going to further reduce the functionality of any membrane pumps. And there's also endonucleases that the calcium will activate, so these are things that will start breaking down DNA and chromatin. And once you start to lose DNA and chromatin within your cell, if you look at these under a microscope, they're actually going to look pink, because the bluish or the darker coloration that cells stain with, that stain sticks to DNA. So if you break down the DNA, there's going to be nothing to give it the blue color. These cells will look pink. Now, as this membrane integrity decreases lower and lower, things like your lysosomes within the cell, those will be released into the cytosol, and those will start to damage the other organelles and things within the cell itself. When the membrane damage becomes severe enough that these can leak out into the surrounding tissue, the things that are around the cell, this is essentially like letting out radioactive waste into the cell environment, and this is going to cause the surrounding inflammation that we see when cells die via necrosis. On the flip side, apoptosis is still a form of cell death, but it is a form of regulated or programmed cell death, and sometimes this is referred to as cell suicide. Now, this is typically part of the regular physiologic process, but it can also occur because of some kind of irreversible cell injury that is created, but it is still a regulated form, so it's not going to cause things like the inflammation in the surrounding tissue that we see in necrosis. Some of the important physiologic functions that this serves are removal of cells during embryogenesis, so things like the webbing between your fingers that actually recedes as you develop due to this. Removal of hormone-dependent tissue when those hormones are removed. So, for example, women will shed their endometrial cells during the menstrual cycle, or lactating breast tissue after a woman stops breastfeeding. These are things that both regress through apoptosis. There can be cell loss in proliferating populations of cells, and these are typically cells that have pretty rapid or regular turnover, so cells within your stomach or within your intestine. It also serves to eliminate any self-reactive immune cells, so you don't want your own immune cells attacking your own body, so your body will eliminate those through apoptosis. And then finally, cells that have fulfilled their physiologic purpose. So for example, some cells within the immune system during acute inflammation, once they fulfill their job, like neutrophils, they will actually be eliminated. Now there are also pathologic situations when damaged cells can be eliminated through apoptosis, and this is beneficial because it gets rid of these damaged cells without causing collateral damage in the tissue next to it through inflammation. And these can be situations like if there is DNA damage occurring within a cell, if there is an accumulation of misfolded proteins, certain types of infections or development of cancer, and also if there is growth factor deprivation. These cells can undergo apoptosis as well. Some of the things that we typically see in apoptosis, in contrast to necrosis, instead of expanding, cells will shrink in size, but they are going to do this while still maintaining their membrane integrity. Chromatin is going to condense and there's going to be nuclear dissolution, but again, this is a regulated process this time. Membrane blebs are going to start to form, which will turn into apoptotic bodies, and this actually contains little contents of cell organelles and broken down tissue. And because these apoptotic bodies are released, they are actually giving off little signals for other cells to come and basically eat them up, so they're not going to cause any inflammation in the surrounding tissue. There are two pathways of apoptosis. The mitochondrial or the intrinsic pathway, this is the primary mechanism of apoptosis, and this occurs as the substance known as cytochrome C, which exists within the mitochondria itself, starts to leak out into the cytoplasm. Now, once it starts to leak out, it's going to activate substances that are already in the cytoplasm called caspases, and once these start to activate, they will activate other caspases, and they will also start to break down the cell contents. As these cell contents start to get broken down, they will actually get packaged up into little membrane blebs, which start to bead off of the cell, and these actually give off little signals to surrounding phagocytic cells that are basically just saying, come get me, I'm ready for digestion, and this helps actually speed the process of apoptosis along so there's no surrounding inflammation. Now, the other pathway of apoptosis is called the death receptor pathway or the extrinsic pathway, and this is due to the fact that this pathway is activated from outside of the cell itself. So on the cell membrane surface are these receptors called the death receptors, or the protein is called FAS or FAS. So certain cells within your body, such as your T lymphocytes, have the ligand for this death receptor and can actually activate it. This is basically the key that turns this death receptor lock. Now, this is typically useful if cells have been infected with a virus or if they are starting to develop a tumor. These immune cells can sense that and will tell the cell to basically self-destruct. Now, once this death receptor is bound externally, it will start to activate caspases within the cell, which will again go down the same cascade that occurred within the mitochondrial pathway. They'll amplify each other and start to break down the cell contents, which they again get packaged up into these apoptotic bodies for phagocytosis by surrounding immune cells.